Connecting to an SQL database in Adonis is really easy. I'm going to start by going to my config directory, and in there I have a database.js, which is the file where all the configurations for databases are put. So in this file, we see that it exports an object, and this object is the database configuration for application. So first of all, we have a connection key right here, and this is env.get db connection, and the default is SQLite, which means if there's no db connection, it's going to default to SQLite. And this env.get is getting environment variables and assigning it to the connection. So if you go to your .env file, which is the file where you define environment variables, you can see that it's defined to SQLite. Back to our database.js, if we scroll down, we can see that this is a configuration for the SQLite connection. So if you npm install save SQLite 3, it's going to install the driver for connecting to the SQLite database. And in this object, you define exactly how to connect to your specific SQLite database. So there's a connection, and then you have a file name property, which gets you the database path, and then gets the database from the environment, defaults to development if none is specified, and .SQLite file. Now, what if you don't want to go with an SQLite connection? Right here, you can define any type of connection you want. For example, we have a MySQL connection, and it requires the MySQL client, so you have to install this package. And then you have the connection variables right here. For example, the host is going to default to localhost, or it's going to get the host from the environment. We have the port, it's going to default to nothing, but it's going to get from the environment. We have the user, it's going to default to root, but it gets from the environment. We have the password, it gets from the environment. If not, it defaults to empty string. And then the database, if it's not specified in the env, then it's going to go to Adonis as default. We also have configurations for Postgres, and any configuration you want, you can put it in this file. In this case, we're going to be connecting to a MySQL database. So the first thing we're going to do is actually follow the instructions, right? So we need to install the MySQL client. So rather than using npm, I'm going to use Adonis to install this. So rather than installing a package with npm install save, I'm going to use Adonis install MySQL. And we're going to be talking more about the advantages in using Adonis to install our packages. Okay, that's done. So, according to the configuration right here, if we want to connect to a MySQL database, we need to specify the connection in our environment file. So we'll go to our .env file, and right here, rather than SQLite, we're going to put in MySQL, which means we want to use this configuration rather than the SQLite configuration above. This configuration requires us to have a DB host in the environment, or it's going to default to localhost, port, user, database, and password. So in the .env file, we already have all of this configured. What's left is actually creating this database on a local machine. I'm going to sign into MySQL user root with a password, and the password is blank. So I'm going to create database, and I'll call that database Adonis. Okay, so that database is created, which means when application tries to connect to this database, it's going to find that database and everything is going to work fine, right? So how do we test our database connection? If you go to your database file, you have a group of files called migrations, and we're going to talk about what these files are. But basically, these files help us to create database tables, columns, rows into our database. So if you want to specify the schema that your database is going to have, you don't need to manually do it like back in the old days. We have migration files, right, that are going to help us do that easily. If you run Adonis help, right here we have a command called migration run, and this is going to run all pending migrations. So I'm going to run Adonis migration run, and right here we have migrate user, migrate token, and we have database migrated successfully, which means it was able to communicate to our database, and it was able to create database tables and database columns with respect to the specification that we gave in our migration files. So what we're going to do is connect to our database and actually check to see if this data is inside our database. I'm going to use SQL Pro for that, and I'm just going to be connecting to my local host 0.0.1, username is root, the password is empty, and the database is Adonis. I'm going to hit connect, and We're into our database and you can see we have three tables. One is called users, one is called token, and one is called Adonis schema. Now, Adonis schema is a table automatically created by Adonis used to track the migrations that have been run and the ones that have not been run. So we have a users table, and that's because we had a user migration right here, and this migration is just an ES6 class that tells Adonis how to create this table. For example, we have a username string field, an email string field, and a password string field, which you can see right here. And we also have an increment, which specifies that we want an auto incrementing primary key right here that is automatically called ID by default. Then we also have some timestamps, which are the created at and the updated at fields. Now, if we also look at the tokens table, we can also check out the migration for that, which specifies these fields, and that's exactly what we get in our database. So we're going to talk more about migrations, but if our migrations run successfully, it means that Adonis is successfully connected to our database. Let's go ahead and talk more about this in the very next lesson.